Hey, what's going on, guys? So this video is going to deal with multiplying radicals, okay? Now, the biggest thing with this is you must not forget your perfect squares, because we know that in order to simplify a radical, we must use our perfect squares to see if we can really take anything out of it. All right? But the first step in multiplying radicals is you always want to just treat the insides of each radical as the things you're multiplying, okay? So basically, if we have radical 3 times radical 6, when you multiply them, you just multiply 3 times 6 and put it inside the radical. So radical 3 times radical 6 is radical 18, okay? The only thing that we have to do left is you always want to see if you can simplify your radical in any way. And what I mean by that is there any perfect squares that can go into 18 that we can bring outside front of the radical? So we got to think our perfect squares really are going to be 4, one doesn't matter, but 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49. We want to see if what is the largest perfect square that can we can factor 18 to be. Okay, so the largest one we can factor 18 to be, we can do 2 times 9, okay, with 9 being our perfect square. Since 9 is the perfect square, we can bring it out front or outside of our square root or radical, and you're left with the square root of 9 is 3, square root of 2. Because you got to think, when you bring the 9 outside the square root, in order for it to leave or exit, it must be square rooted, and the square root of 9 becomes 3. The 2, we can't factor that into a perfect square at all, so the 2 just stays, and your final answer is 3, square root of 2. Okay. Really, the only thing new here is multiplying the radicals. This whole simplifying thing, you know, but it's one of the things that kids always forget. All right. So every problem, when you get to the end, you want to simplify. All right. Next one. We have square root of 5 times square root of 2. Again, just multiply the insides together. You get square root of 10 because 5 times 2 is 10. All right. Now we got to see, can we divide 10 by any perfect squares? Your answer is going to be no, because 5 and 2 are the only factors of 10. Can't simplify it. And that's that. Again, you just multiply inside by inside. See if you can simplify it. Square root of 10 can't be changed at all. So that's your final answer. Moving along. This one's a little different because you have 5 square root of 2 times the square root of 6. Okay? But even though it's different, it's still pretty easy. If you notice, this 5 is outside the square root. Okay? Any numbers outside the square root, when you're multiplying them, you multiply outside by outside, inside by inside. So if we look here, out front of the square root of 6 is really just a 1. Okay? So it's going to be 5 times 1 is 5. Square root 2 times 6 is 12. Okay? Now, we have to, again, this is, the multiplication's done here, but we still need to simplify this in a way to see if we can make the square root of 12 change it all by perfect squares. All right, so if we know we can divide 12 by 4, so it becomes 3, the square root of 3 times 4, because 4 is the biggest perfect square that goes into 12 evenly. And again, we can't forget about this 5 outside. So just like in the first problem, since 4 is a perfect square, we can bring it outside the square root, okay? So when we have that, we have 5. When you bring a 4 out, the square root of 4 becomes 2, and then it's square root of 3, okay? A lot of times kids forget this step, but if you notice, just because the 5 is outside the square root, it really just means it's 5 times the square root of 3 times 4. But when you bring the 4 on, it turns to a 2, it becomes 5 times 2 times square root of 3. We all know 5 times 2 is 10. So your answer is 10, radical 3, okay? Again, this is a step that kids fall into. When you bring your perfect square out of the square root and it becomes out front, you still have to multiply whatever number was already out there, okay? If we go back to the first example, outside here was a 1, so 3 times 1 is just 3. But that's why this one becomes 5 times 2, becomes 10, radical 3. Again, this one's, again, a little more difficult, but in the end, it's really not anything crazy, okay? If we notice, we have 4 radical 3 times 5 radical 5. Again, multiply outside by outside, so 4 times 5 is 20. And then square root inside times inside is 15. Okay, so we did our multiplication. We have 20 square root of 15. Can we break 15 into any perfect squares? The answer is no, because the only factors of 15 are 5 and 3. And you're left with 20 radical 15. All right, this is going to be the last one. But I hope you guys are kind of understanding that when you multiply radicals, it's always outside by outside. 2 times 4 is 8. Inside by inside. 6 times 3 is 18. And then once you just get one radical, you want to be able to see if you can break the inside of the square root into factors that involve a perfect square. All right. So again, 18. We already did this one. Breaks into 2. Oops, not 2 times 18. 2 times 9. Since 9 is the highest or the largest perfect square that goes into 18, so we can bring a 9 out front, since it's a perfect square. When the 9 leaves, it becomes a 3, so you actually get 8 times 3 square root of 2, which gives you 24 square root of 2. Okay, and those are really all the possible scenarios, really, when you're multiplying radicals. You always do outside by outside, insides by insides. Once you get down to one radical, see if you can simplify the radical using perfect squares. Bring the perfect square out, do whatever you got to do, and that's your final answer. All right. Hopefully you guys understood this, and it's pretty straightforward. Again, if you have any questions, just rewatch the video, because the process never changes, only the numbers. So once you understand the idea that it's outside by outside, inside by inside, then when you get one radical, simplify the inside the square root using your perfect squares, and you're good to go. All right. If you have any questions, email me. Check out the rest of the website. Hopefully you learned some, and have a good one. All right, one last kind of multiplying radical problem, which I kind of overlooked because, I don't know, it's pretty simple, is if you ever have this radical 3 times radical 3. What I mean by this is if you have the radical of the same thing multiplied by itself, there's always a nice little trick, okay? Again, you still do it the same way you always do, so radical 3 times radical 3 becomes radical 9, but we know that the square root of 9 is just 3, okay? Some of you guys probably already see the trick. Again, here, radical 5 times radical 5. We multiply inside by inside, so you get radical 25. So square root of 25 is just 5. The trick here is that if you multiply the square root of a number times the square root of the same number, your answer just simplifies to that number. Okay, it's always going to happen no matter what. And if you don't believe me, well, here's square root of 9 times square root of 9 becomes square root of 81, which is just 9. Okay. Again, that's just a quick little thing in multiplying radicals I forgot to put in the video, so I'm just throwing it on the end. All right, enjoy.